So in this video, I'm going to teach you how I get these vocals to sound huge and beautiful and spacious using a very simple method and technique, as well as using a bunch of cool textures from my upcoming kit. I'm going to show you exactly what they sound like, and there's also a really cool rhythm to the main melody, and it's a really simple thing to do, but I'm going to show you exactly what I did and what gave it that feeling. I'm also going to explain the different VSTs and plugins that I used to make this and just get into everything. So here's what it sounds like. Okay, so the way I achieved this intro was I created this pattern on the piano, and it sounds like this. So what I did there, I'm going to play this with a metronome, and you'll hear that stab just gives a slightly different rhythm, which makes the sample a bit more unique and gives it more rhythmic drive. So listen to this with the metronome on. That. And again. So super simple, but just having that stab come in like half a note earlier, it just gives it a cool sense of rhythmic drive and just makes the sample a little bit more interesting. Now this piano was the Dusky preset within Neufeld, and then all I did to fill this out was simply copy and paste this piano melody onto Analog Lab, and I used this preset called Contin. This is from Keon's Multi Keys 3. And it sounds amazing. I added a bit of halftime on it and quite a lot of reverb to really wash it out. And because the piano is the main source of attention, I wanted this to be a lush background texture. So this is what it sounds like with the exact same MIDI pattern. And what multi-keys are is it's essentially a cycle of about 4 notes. So if you play one key 4 times, it will play 4 different sounds or notes or accents or whatever. So you can imagine when you're playing chords, instead of just all of them sounding like the same instrument, you're getting different keys and textures from that same chords. So multi-keys are really good for those lush background textures, and especially for layering them with something like a piano. So check it out. I'm going to play the piano by itself and then with the background texture. You know, it's a nice melody, but then listen to it with. And underneath I've laid this percussive element, and it's very subtle, and it's from my kit Mirage, which is about to come out, and it just sounds like this. I've also layered some like just bedroom noise, which just sounds like this. It's very, very subtle. And because it's a very spacious ambient sample, using sound effects like room noise can just add a lot of warmth and depth to your samples. And then going from the first 4 bars to the next 4 bars, I have this beautiful, beautiful glide texture, which is also from my upcoming kit Mirage, and it sounds like this. So that sound really just bridges those first 4 chords into the next 4, and it just helps build up the sample and create more excitement or like tension leading into the next bit. So rather than just copying and pasting the exact same chords over and over again, you have something that builds upon, because generally you want your samples to kind of build, right? It has the listener, the producer, waiting for more, because it's like, oh, something else is coming, something else is coming. So just having this accent, you know, I've washed it out with a lot of delay. You can see I've got stereo delay, I've got tape delay, I've got some panning, I've cut out some of the lows with some EQ, but it just does so much. And on its own, it sounds like this. Super washed out ambient, and it just leads into the next few chords so beautifully. I've also taken some of the piano chords and reversed them. This just gave it more impact as well. So on their own, they sound like this. So again, that reversed ambient feel, and these were literally just chords from the main piano melody, and just reversed them so they had this effect. Now don't worry, the vocals are about to come in, but this little bit transitioning into the sort of the verse or the bridge, just the next section, I included this little gap, this little space where everything cut out, and then you just hear that reverse piano and this new texture, also from my kit Mirage, and on its own it sounds like this. So it's a very thin texture, and that's a really nice piece of contrast when you have this build up. Into the next section. Okay, the vocals are coming in right now. The vocals are coming in, but one last thing that you might have noticed is I had this simple little percussive element, kind of a chime bell sound, and that was just also a really nice contrast from the bass that came in, because that's a very high end shimmery frequency, and then you have the distorted low end subby bass. And the reason it's distorted sounding as well is because I pitched this whole project, which tends to introduce some artifacts and some kind of distorted harmonics, so I actually like that sound stylistically. Pitching your projects, especially with the SoundShift plugin from Waves. This is not sponsored. This plugin is amazing, and it gives you a certain sound when you start pitching stuff around. So, but again, just pay attention to it crescendoing, and then, you know, when things cut out, there's like this anticipation, and then it's just like a release. So we've just got these thin layers. And again, all I did was just copy and paste the same melody. I'm telling you, it works if you have good sound selection. It's a way to make your samples interesting with less work. Just taking that same melody and also maintaining that consistent melody, but in just different sounds that are thinner, that are larger, that are smaller, that are fuller, that are higher, that are lower, etc. Just having variation whilst still maintaining that same melody and that same feeling, because that feeling is largely going to come from your main melody. So I use this PD Just a Phase preset. This is from Tom Wolfe's Atlantis Diva presets. It's PD Just a Phase, so a really nice sounding pad, and I always find it really interesting to see how the same melody sounds on different VSTs, different instruments, because like you hear with this one, it's a pad that's very kind of lush and washed out, so, and it's got a very slow kind of like high attack, so you're not hearing all these like little notes, the singular like kind of runs that are happening here. You hear a lot more clearly on something like the piano, but with the pad it kind of gets washed out, but you're still just getting that main kind of chord feeling. So I don't seem to have kept the original MIDI, but I believe this was just another set of multi keys using the same melody, and it sounds like this. Okay, we're going to get into the vocal section now and what I did. And just to preface, this is the warm sub from the Tyrell collection. That is the bass that I used. Very, very simple pattern. And it almost just repeats, just following those sort of root notes. And so now leading in with the vocal. Bring back the piano. Oh, and I've got these very just subtle little swells, which are just a percussion loop, and I've just chopped one of the hits and reversed it, so it sounds like this. Very small, very subtle. Now, the reason this vocal works so well is because of space, and I know this seems really obvious, but let me break down what I mean and give you a visual example. So for the most part, it's basically made up of the vocals and the sub bass, and then you have a few little textures in between just playing sparsely. So for example, here you can see very visually that most of this is just the vocal with some very thin textures, which also another sound from my kit Mirage, and all I've done is just pitch it like down as it progresses. So I think it's important that you have sort of a focal point. So if it is the vocal, try not to take away from it, simply build it up, and these just little small textures do that. This is another sound from my Mirage kit. So these are very subtle sounds that surround the vocal. They don't take away from the vocal. Now here is the visual representation as to why the vocals stand out the way that they do. Here I've got the EQ of the sub bass, and here I've got the EQ to the vocals. Now there's a lot of dips because I just found a lot of harsh frequencies. That's why there's so many of them. But look at the difference in what is taking up which space. If you were to overlap these, the bass is obviously just taking up that low end. Look, it's the main focus is around like 50 to 150 hertz, and then it really drops off by about 470, 500, and the vocal really only starts at like almost 600 hertz, and that leaves a lot of focus on both elements. It's really easy for the listener or the producer to focus on those two sounds. They just fit perfectly side by side. Now, you don't always want to do this in your samples, but if you have something like a vocal that you want to emphasize and you want to have impact, especially in something that's so atmospheric sounding, then give it its own space. Don't clash frequencies. Again, I had all these textures coming in, but even though they might have been in a similar frequency range, I believe a lot of these are in sort of the mids, the highs, which is kind of where the vocal is sitting, right? So listen. You know, a lot of the mids. Yeah, it's very mid focused, which to be fair, even then, the vocals are quite high focused, the sub bass is very low focused. There's some overlap in the mids, but even then, everything kind of has its own space. And on top of that, I've decided to use the textures when the vocal kind of comes out, when there's space. So doing all this just gives the sample so much more clarity and impact when a sound does come in, because you don't have 10 different sounds playing at once. And I know this seems obvious, but it's really commonly overlooked and easy to just muddy up a mix by adding a lot of textures, which is very common in samples these days. Textures add so much to a sample. But if you're trying to have a main focus point like a vocal in your sample, then leave that frequency alone or try and give it its own space, because I promise it's going to give your samples so much more impact. A great example of a sample maker that utilizes space that I personally study a lot these days is Nico Baron. His samples are oftentimes 1, 2, maybe 3 sounds playing at once, maybe. But in doing that, there's just so much more emphasis and focus that goes to that instrument, because you haven't got all this other clutter and stuff happening around it. I just think going into this section, I realized why the vocals just sat so well, and it's because they just have their own room. Vocals, bass, textures when there's no vocals. Now, the outro, I have the piano and the vocal, which obviously works, and I love the way it sounds together, but I think you notice that there's obviously less emphasis, there's less impact on those vocals. Now maybe it's because we've already been listening to the vocals, but honestly so much of this simply comes down to frequency range and space. Because the piano is sitting in those mids, you see it's taking up much of the spectrum. But remember, we noticed on the EQ of the vocal that a lot of the sound was coming in around here, around 500, 600. The piano's also sitting here. See? If you look beneath here, you know, that's comfortably sitting in the sort of low mids and with some highs. But that's also where some of the vocals sitting. So I think instantly you notice the vocals have slightly less impact, which is fine, and it's just variation. Now, a way I've tried to split those two is also by using a vocal that's, you know, got a lot of reverb. It's really washed out, it sounds larger, and the piano sounds closer and more intimate. So even though they're in a similar frequency range, I've still created space by using the stereo field, having things not clash and fight for the exact same position. But yeah, that is the main takeaway of this sample, of this video, that I learned, is that using something like a bass and then coupled with a high-end focused instrument, it doesn't even have to be a vocal. Having simplicity and giving the tracks their own space just creates so much more impact and clarity in your samples. There's always room for sections where you're gonna have tons of layers and you're gonna have things going back and forth and things that are taking up a similar frequency range, but just especially then having a section introduced that is a bit more bare bones and that gives a certain track its kind of space and time to shine just brings so much more impact in your samples, in your melodies. And even with things like drums, the same concept can be applied. If you want an 808 to really stand out, make sure nothing else is hogging that same frequency range. So hopefully this helps. Hopefully this is something you can apply in your own tracks, whether it's your beats or your melodies or both. And I have so many more samples and melodies like this that I'm going to break down and just show you some of the little gems that I've picked up along the way, and hopefully you can learn from. So if you want to see more of that, you can subscribe. And remember that most of these textures, the sounds, came from my texture and phrases kit, Mirage. This is coming out in less than a week now, so stay tuned for that. If it's out already, it'll be in the link below. And until then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.